Imagine a conflict that literally engulfs the entire globe, dictating foreign policy for over 4 decades and threatening the very existence of humanity. But here's the wild part. Directly between its two main combatants, not a single shot is ever fired. Today, we're diving into a cinematic overview of the Cold War in this explainer. We're going to examine exactly how the United States and the Soviet Union waged a relentless shadow war that completely reshaped our modern world. And we'll be relying on declassified documents, intelligence reports, and strategic frameworks to see exactly how this incredible standoff unfolded.
To really grasp the stakes of this era, we need to look no further than this chilling realization from Robert McNamara as he recalled the Cuban Missile Crisis. Listen to those last 3 words: in utter disaster. The Cold War wasn't just some abstract political chess match. It was an era where the fate of the entire world hung by a thread, and every single strategic move carried apocalyptic weight.
Okay, Section 1. The Iron Curtain descends, setting the board for a global standoff. Right after World War II, the world was essentially pulled through the looking glass. You had the Soviet Union and the United States, who were just wartime allies against Nazi Germany, right? Rapidly turning into fierce ideological enemies. The globe became this dangerously unstable landscape of democratic and totalitarian states. This birthed what the U.S. National Archives officially defines as a Cold War. It's a period of extreme political and military tension, but short of actual armed conflict between the U.S. and the USSR. They couldn't fight directly without risking mutual annihilation, so they had to invent a completely new, unprecedented type of conflict. It was all about brinksmanship, pushing the military right to the absolute edge of war just to force the other side to back down. Picture the setting for a moment. It's 1953. We're inside the wood-paneled Solarium room of the White House. President Dwight D. Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, are sitting right there. They're watching the world tilt toward communism following the death of Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, and they desperately need a coherent national strategy. This urgency is what birthed Project Solarium. And the resulting strategy, which you can see outlined in this declassified Project Solarium paper, presented some incredibly stark options. One option literally argued that the president should vigorously try to roll back the Soviet Empire, using military force if necessary. It even suggested completely sealing off Iron Curtain countries for all political and economic purposes, basically slicing the planet into 2 totally distinct worlds. The sheer aggression and high stakes of containment versus liberation, they were codified right here on this typed page. Moving on to Section 2, Weapons of the Shadow War. Espionage, propaganda, and proxy battles. Because direct military action was just way too risky, the battleground had to shift into the shadows. And a huge front in this shadow war was the battle for minds. The U.S. Information Agency, or USIA, leaned heavily into psychological warfare to project American values. Take Turkey, for example. The U.S. used publications like the Daslit newspaper to really hammer home the dangers of communist ideology, while simultaneously holding up American culture, sports, and the arts as this benevolent, superior alternative. It was a highly calculated campaign to use the American way of life as an actual weapon of soft power. But of course, the shadows also hid some massive betrayals. Enter the top-secret Venona project, which successfully decrypted Soviet diplomatic telegrams. What they found was a massive, and I mean massive, Soviet espionage network operating right inside the West. We're talking about spies like Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs leaking crucial atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets. Venona revealed that Soviet agents had actually infiltrated the U.S. State Department, the Office of Strategic Services, and even the Treasury. So, you know that intense paranoia of the era? Well, it turns out it was actually pretty justified by the facts. But hey, the espionage definitely went both ways. Just consider the incredibly gripping story of Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Penkovsky. He was a highly placed Soviet military intelligence officer in the GRU who secretly became a spy for the US and UK. Penkovsky handed over absolutely vital information on Soviet intentions and their tech advancements. By giving the West a peek behind the Iron Curtain, he actually helped lessen Cold War tensions. But man, he paid the ultimate price for it. He was caught and executed for treason by the Soviets in 1963. That brings us to Section 3, the nuclear brink, mutually assured destruction, and the missile gap. As this intelligence war was raging, both sides were busy building arsenals that were literally capable of ending civilization. To explain why these arsenals grew so insanely fast, historians use a few different models, like the ones you see here. The most prominent one is the action-reaction model. Think about it. The US had a total nuclear monopoly until 1949, when the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb. The US reaction, well, obviously, developed the vastly more powerful hydrogen bomb. Every action provoked a terrifyingly predictable reaction. And when leaders pursued the military superiority model, like when the Soviets later deployed their mobile SS-20 missiles, it just cranked the dial on that cycle of escalation faster and faster. Now, a lot of this escalation was fueled by something called the missile gap. Because Soviet society was so incredibly closed off, Western intelligence initially had super limited ways to collect information. So in 1957, when the Soviets announced a successful intercontinental ballistic missile test and then quickly followed it up by launching Sputnik, it sparked absolute panic in the US. The perception was that America was falling drastically behind. The CIA had to scramble and invent some pure technological wizardry, like the U-2 spy plane and Corona satellites, just to photograph test centers like Pushchin Yar and figure out the truth. Ultimately, the gap was a total misperception, but the fear it generated, oh, that was very, very real. And that fear drove us right up to the edge of the abyss. Tracing this timeline shows exactly how fast things spun out of control. In 1959, the U.S. decides to deploy Jupiter nuclear missiles near the Soviet border in Turkey. Fast forward to April 1962, and they're fully operational. Just a few months later, in October 1962, U.S. intelligence makes a horrifying discovery. The Soviets are secretly building their own nuclear missile installations just 90 miles from Florida, in Cuba. By dropping nuclear weapons right on each other's doorsteps, both superpowers effectively back themselves into an existential corner. The craziest part about all this is how incredibly close we actually came to the end of the world. Declassified documents and leader conferences in Havana exposed these hidden terrors of the Cuban Missile Crisis that the Kennedy administration didn't even know about at the time. For instance, the U.S. was strongly considering a military air attack and invasion of Cuba. But what they didn't know was that the Soviets already had 9 tactical nuclear missiles right there on the island, ready to defend against an invasion. And it gets worse. Soviet field commanders in Cuba actually had the authority to fire those nukes without even waiting for orders from Moscow. If the U.S. had invaded, local commanders could have launched nuclear weapons and triggered immediate global annihilation. Thankfully, diplomacy won out, the missiles were withdrawn, but the Cold War dragged on for decades until its sudden, breathtaking resolution. Which leads us to Section 4, the Soviet collapse, the final act of the Cold War. While the public's eyes were almost always glued to the missiles and the military posturing, the CIA was quietly tracking a completely different kind of threat to the Soviet Union: structural rot. A declassified CIA report reveals that, going all the way back to the 1960s, the U.S. intelligence community was meticulously recording declining growth rates and fatal stagnation inside the Soviet economy. Now, poor economic performance happens everywhere, sure, but the peacetime collapse of an entire political system, that's unique. The foundations of the USSR were crumbling long before the rest of the world even noticed. The end finally arrived in what intelligence estimates described as a great drama unfolding in 3 distinct acts between 1989 and 1991. Let's break those acts down. Act 1 kicks off with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. In a desperate bid to save a tail-spinning economy, he made some truly unprecedented concessions on arms control and pulled troops out of Afghanistan. Then, Act 2 hits in the fall of 1989. Peaceful revolutions just sweep across Eastern Europe. The Outer Empire falls, the Warsaw Pact effectively disintegrates, and Germany is finally reunited. And then, the finale, Act 3 in 1991. The centrifugal forces of reform just spun entirely out of control. Gorbachev's intense struggles with the old communist elite climaxed in a failed August coup, which was pretty much the final nail on the coffin for the USSR. And so, we reach the surprisingly quiet end to an incredibly loud era. On Christmas Day, December 25, 1991, at exactly 7:35 p.m., the Soviet flag flying over the Kremlin was lowered for the very last time, replaced by the Russian banner. The USSR officially ceased to exist just days later. 4 decades of the Cold War, a global shadow war filled with spies, proxy battles, and nuclear brinksmanship, was officially, and remarkably peacefully, over. But as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves a vital question based on the history we just went through. The Cold War ended, right? But the weapons built during it are still here. As we look at today's increasingly fractured geopolitical landscape, with new arms races and renewed great power competition, just how fragile is the nuclear peace we still take for granted? It's a pretty sobering thought. And honestly, it's one that makes understanding this history more important than ever. Thanks for exploring this with me today.